What if the person who holds the key to your entire future, the one who can save not just your life but your very soul, is the person you've been trained to overlook every single day? What if the hero you're waiting for isn't wearing a crown or sitting in a boardroom, but is covered in grease, with hands that know the language of broken things? This is the story of Aria Vale and Ethan, a story about a fall from the sky that led to a redemption on the ground. And it asks a simple question: what is the true measure of a person's worth? We love to see how far our stories travel, so please let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, subscribe to our channel for more. The afternoon sun glinted off the polished chrome and glass of the helicopter, a silver dragonfly dancing over the concrete canyons of the city. Inside, Aria Vale stared down, but she didn't see the people, the cars, the life teeming below. She saw a grid, a chessboard of assets and acquisitions, a kingdom she had built with ruthless precision. Her tailored suit was a suit of armor, her expression a mask of impenetrable control. She was the CEO of Vale Industries, a titan of commerce whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. The low thrum of the rotors was the soundtrack of her power, a steady, unwavering beat that mirrored the rhythm of her own heart. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset, a respectful murmur about their estimated arrival time. She gave a curt nod, her mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating, strategizing, conquering. To her, the world was a series of problems to be solved, vulnerabilities to be exploited, and goals to be crushed. Emotion was a liability. Connection was a weakness. The city below wasn't a home to millions. It was a testament to her victory, a monument of glass and steel she had bent to her will. Then, the rhythm broke. A sudden, violent shudder ripped through the cabin, a metallic cough that was utterly alien to the smooth symphony of the flight. Aria's head snapped up from her tablet, her mask of control momentarily faltering. A flicker of annoyance, not fear, crossed her face. Delays were for other people. The pilot's voice, now strained, crackled again. A string of technical jargon she didn't understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. Red lights flashed across the console, a frantic, silent scream. The steady thrum of the rotors devolved into a chaotic, grinding shriek. The helicopter lurched sideways, throwing Aria against the window. For the first time, she saw the city not as a grid, but as a hard, unforgiving reality rushing up to meet her. The pilot was fighting the controls, his knuckles white, his face a sheet of sweat and panic. The machine, her symbol of dominance and freedom, had become a cage, a plummeting coffin of glass and steel. And in that terrifying, weightless descent, stripped of her title and her wealth, Aria Vale was just a woman, falling from the sky. Miles below, in a small, cluttered garage, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, Ethan's hands were stained with the day's labor. Grease was embedded in his knuckles, a testament to a life of honest, humble work. He was tightening a bolt on a vintage engine, his focus absolute. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a listener, a translator of mechanical pain. He could hear the soul of a machine in his hums, its clicks, its silences, and that's when he heard it. A sound that cut through the city's drone like a razor. It wasn't just a helicopter in distress. It was a specific model, a turbine engine experiencing catastrophic blade fatigue. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound that haunted his dreams. He dropped his wrench, the clang echoing in the sudden silence of the garage. He ran outside, wiping his hands on a rag as he scanned the sky. There it was, a silver dragonfly, crippled, spiraling. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of memory and instinct. He saw its trajectory, calculated its likely point of impact. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about who was inside. He only knew one thing. Something was broken, and it was his nature to fix it. He started to run, his worn work boots pounding against the cracked pavement, his long legs eating up the distance, running toward the plume of smoke that had already begun to rise. The crash site was a vision of chaos, a wound torn in the earth. Twisted metal hissed and groaned, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of fuel and burning electronics. Ethan was the first to arrive, his chest heaving, his senses on high alert. He moved with a purpose that defied the surrounding panic, his mind a calm island in a sea of destruction. He saw the pilot, dazed but alive, and helped him away from the main wreckage. Then his eyes fell on the mangled passenger cabin. Through the shattered plexiglass, he saw her, a woman in a dark suit, slumped and still, with a bloody gash on her forehead. A small flicker of flame licked at a ruptured fuel line nearby, a deadly timer counting down. He didn't see a CEO. He didn't see wealth or power. He saw a life hanging by a thread. The door was jammed, the frame warped by the impact. Bystanders were frozen, staring, filming on their phones. But Ethan saw a problem to be solved. He raced back to his garage, his mind already disassembling the challenge. He returned moments later with a crowbar and a heavy-duty cutter, tools of his trade that were about to become instruments of salvation. He worked with a ferocious, focused intensity. The fire was growing, the heat becoming unbearable. He ignored the shouts of warning from the gathering crowd. He jammed the crowbar into a seam in the door, his muscles straining, the sinews in his arms standing out like steel cables. He found the leverage point, a place of weakness in the mangled frame that only an expert eye could see. The metal groaned in protest, then gave way with a sickening shriek. It was enough. He squeezed through the gap, the smoke stinging his eyes and scorching his lungs. Inside the cabin, the air was a toxic soup. He reached for the woman, his hands finding the buckle of her seatbelt. It was jammed. Without a moment's pause, he used a cutter, slicing through the thick nylon strap. He gathered her into his arms, her body limp, her life an unconscious weight against his chest. As he backed out of the wreckage, the flames erupted, engulfing the cabin in a whoosh of fire. He didn't look back. He carried her to a safe distance, laid her gently on the grass, and immediately began to check her vitals, his grimy, calloused hands moving with the practiced gentleness of a surgeon. Aria's first sensation was the sterile, antiseptic smell of a hospital. Her second was a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate from her entire body. She opened her eyes to a world of white. White walls, white sheets, white light. Her assistant, Marcus, a perpetually anxious man whose loyalty was his greatest virtue, was sitting by her bedside, his face pale. "You're awake," he breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. Aria tried to sit up, her mind already rebooting, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of the last few hours. The shudder, the fall, the fire. "What happened?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "The helicopter crashed, Miss Vale," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly. "But you're safe. Someone pulled you out." Aria processed this information with a chilling detachment. Safe. It was an acceptable outcome. Now, for the details. "Who?" she asked, the single word a command. "A local mechanic, apparently," Marcus replied, consulting his phone. "He was the first on the scene," the paramedics said. "They said he saved your life. He was gone by the time the authorities could get his name. A mechanic." The word hung in the air, foreign and incongruous in her world of titans and tycoons. A blue-collar worker had saved her. It was an untidy detail, a debt that needed to be settled. 10 years earlier, Aria Vale was not in a helicopter, but in the cramped, dusty attic of her childhood home, packing away the last remnants of her family's life. Her father, a man with a brilliant mind for engineering but a disastrous one for business, had just declared bankruptcy. She watched as he was patronized by men in suits, men who spoke of numbers and bottom lines with a casual cruelty that broke him. That day, standing amidst the ghosts of her family's failed dreams, a cold, hard resolve formed in her heart. She would never be weak. She would never be a victim. She would learn the language of those men in suits, and she would become more fluent, more ruthless than any of them. Her life became a relentless climb. She sacrificed friendships, holidays, and the very idea of a personal life for her ambition. Her first office was a cubicle. Her last was a sprawling corner suite on the 80th floor of the city's tallest building. The view from her window was her daily affirmation. She hadn't just joined their world, she had conquered it. Vale Industries was her fortress, its soaring profits, the high walls that protected her from the memory of that dusty attic, from the ghost of her father's failure. 15 years earlier, Ethan was not in a garage, but in a sprawling, immaculately clean Air Force hangar. The air didn't smell of oil and gasoline, but of jet fuel and ozone. He wasn't a mechanic. He was a lead aerospace engineer, one of the brightest minds in his division. His hands, then, were clean, moving over blueprints and digital models with an artist's precision. He was surrounded by the most advanced aircraft in the world, and he knew them intimately, not as weapons, but as marvels of design and function. His passion was a specific prototype, a revolutionary helicopter design that promised greater speed, efficiency, and safety. It was his baby. He'd spent thousands of hours on it, perfecting every line, every gear, every single component. He worked alongside his best friend, a pilot named Leo, who was slated to be the first to fly the prototype. They shared a dream of changing the future of aviation, a dream forged in late nights, endless cups of coffee, and an unshakable faith in the power of good engineering. That hangar was his sanctuary, a place of order and purpose, where every problem had a logical solution and integrity was the highest law. The dream turned into a nightmare on a Tuesday, the day of the final test flight. A week prior, Ethan had discovered that a key subcontractor, under pressure to cut costs, had supplied a batch of rotor bearings made from a substandard alloy. He had filed a report, his voice shaking with a cold fury as he argued with his superiors and the corporate liaison. He presented the data, the stress simulations, the undeniable proof that the parts were flawed, that they would fail. The liaison, a man with a practiced smile and eyes as cold as a banker's heart, had assured him it was within acceptable tolerance levels. The budget, he explained, was a more pressing reality than Ethan's theoretical concerns. Leo, trusting the chain of command, had clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "It'll be fine," he'd said. "Your design is perfect." But a perfect design with a flawed heart is a death trap. Ethan watched from the control tower as the prototype went down. He heard the same grinding shriek, saw the same sickening spiral. He lost his friend, his career, and his faith in the system, all in one fiery crash. He walked away from the world of blueprints and boardrooms, seeking a place where his hands could fix what was real, what was right in front of him, a place where integrity couldn't be overruled by a budget line. Back in the pristine white of her hospital room, Aria made a decision. This loose end, this mechanic, needed to be tied up. It was a matter of protocol, of closing a loop. Gratitude was an emotion she didn't often indulge, but she understood the concept of a debt, and this was a significant one. "Marcus," she said, her voice regaining its familiar tone of command. "Find him. I don't care how. Get his name, his address, and prepare a check." She paused, considering a number. What was the going rate for a life? The question was absurd, yet in her world, everything had a price. She settled on an astronomical figure, a sum that could buy a man like that a new life, a new garage, a dozen new garages. It was a grand, sweeping gesture, but it was also a dismissal. It was a way of re-establishing the natural order of her world. She, the powerful benefactor, and he, the grateful recipient. The transaction would be clean, simple, and final. She would thank him, hand him the check, and walk away. The debt paid, the slate wiped clean. She had no interest in his story, his life, his motivations. He was a footnote in her near-death experience, and it was time to turn the page. The sleek black town car, a silent predator of the corporate jungle, looked utterly alien as it purred to a stop in front of Ethan's auto repair. The garage was a humble, unassuming brick building, its windows clouded with a fine layer of dust, and its large bay door painted a faded blue. Aria stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the oil-stained concrete, her crisp, white suit a stark beacon in the grimy landscape. The contrast was jarring, a deliberate statement of the gulf between their two worlds. She adjusted her jacket, her posture rigid, her face a mask of polite determination. She was on his turf, but she brought her atmosphere of power with her. The air here was different, thick with the smell of gasoline and hard work, a world away from the filtered, climate-controlled air of her high-rise office. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the encounter. This was a simple transaction, she reminded herself. An errand, but as she pushed open the small, squeaky office door, a strange sense of unease settled over her. The interior of the garage was a cathedral of organized chaos. Tools lined the walls in neat, well-used rows. Engines in various states of deconstruction sat on stands like complex sculptures. Sunlight streamed through the dusty skylights, illuminating dancing motes of dust and casting a warm, almost reverent glow on the scene. In the center of it all was Ethan. He was bent over the open hood of a car, his back to her, completely absorbed in his work. He moved with an unhurried, graceful efficiency, his hands seeming to know the engine's secrets by touch alone. Sitting on a stool nearby, nursing a mug of coffee, was an older man with a kind, weathered face and a full head of white hair. This was Ben, a mechanic from the old school who had forgotten more about cars than most people ever learned. He saw Aria enter, his intelligent eyes taking in her expensive suit, her powerful aura, and the faint, lingering shadow of trauma behind her eyes. He gave a slow, knowing smile but said nothing, content to watch the scene unfold. Aria cleared her throat. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Ethan." He turned, and for the first time, she saw her savior. He was tall, with a lean, strong build. His face was handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear blue, calm and intelligent, and they looked at her with an unnerving directness, as if they could see right through the expensive armor she wore. "I'm Ethan," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. He wiped his hands on a rag, though it did little to remove the ingrained grease. "You're Aria Vale," he added. It wasn't a question. "I came to thank you," Aria said, getting straight to the point. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a sleek portfolio. Inside was the check. "This is a token of my gratitude for what you did." She held it out to him. It was a king's ransom, enough to solve every problem a man like him could have. It was power, freedom, and security, all written on a single piece of paper. Ethan looked from the check in her hand to her eyes. He saw the expectation there, the certainty. He saw a woman accustomed to solving every problem with money. He didn't take the portfolio. Instead, a small, wry smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I don't want your money, Miss Vale," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the silence of the garage. Aria's perfectly composed expression faltered. A flicker of disbelief, then confusion, crossed her face. She was holding a winning lottery ticket, and he was simply shaking his head. "I don't understand," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "This is a life-changing amount of money." "I'm sure it is," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But you can't put a price on a life. I did what anyone should have done." "I'm glad you're okay." He turned back to the engine, the gesture a clear dismissal. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Aria stood there, holding the check, feeling a strange mix of fury and bewilderment. No one refused her. No one walked away from her. The clean, simple transaction she had envisioned had just become impossibly complicated. In the days that followed, Aria couldn't get him out of her head. The refusal of the check was a puzzle her logical mind couldn't solve. It defied every rule of the world she knew, a world where everyone had a price, a motive, an angle. She tasked Marcus with digging into Ethan's life, expecting to find some hidden leverage, some secret that would explain his bizarre behavior. The report that came back only deepened the mystery. Ethan lived in a small apartment above the garage. He had modest debts, a truck that was paid off, and no criminal record. He had no savings to speak of. He volunteered at a local youth center, teaching kids basic mechanics on weekends. By every metric of success Aria valued, the man was a failure. He was unambitious, unmotivated, and content with his small, greasy corner of the world. And yet, he had possessed a calm and a certainty that she, with all her wealth and power, profoundly lacked. The puzzle of him became an obsession, a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of her world that she had to pull. Driven by this gnawing curiosity, Aria found an excuse to return. She had her driver take her personal sports car, a pristine European model that was her one indulgence, to his garage. She claimed there was a strange noise in the engine. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was the only one she could think of. She found him in the same spot, working with the same quiet intensity. He looked up when her car pulled in, a brief flicker of surprise in his eyes, which he quickly masked. "Miss Vale," he said, his tone neutral. "Car trouble?" She explained the imaginary noise, feeling a bit foolish under his knowing gaze. He simply nodded, popped the hood, and began his examination. Aria stood back, intending to observe him from a distance, like a scientist studying a strange new specimen. She watched the way his hands moved over the complex machinery, a dance of innate understanding. He wasn't just looking, he was listening, feeling, diagnosing. He treated the engine with a kind of reverence, a respect for its design and purpose. It was a form of care she hadn't witnessed before, and it was utterly captivating. As he worked, she tried to engage him in conversation, to draw him out, to find the key to his puzzle. She spoke her language, the language of assets, of growth, of value. "This garage," she said, gesturing around the space, "it has potential. With the right investment, you could franchise, expand. Your skills are a marketable asset." Ethan paused his work and looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long moment. "Some things aren't assets, Ms. Vale," he said, his voice gentle but carrying a hint of steel. "They're just responsibilities." He pointed to a worn gear he had just removed from her engine. "This part is failing. It's not about making a profit from it. It's about replacing it so the whole system doesn't fall apart. Some things just need to work right. His words hung in the air between them, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond the mechanics of her car. He wasn't just talking about an engine. He was talking about a worldview, a philosophy so fundamentally different from her own that it felt like it came from another planet. And she had the unnerving feeling that he was diagnosing a failure not just in her car, but in her as well. While Ethan finished the repair, Ben, the old mechanic, ambled over to where Aria was standing. He held out a steaming mug. "Coffee?" he offered. She hesitated, then accepted. "He's a good boy, Ethan," Ben said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He looked at Aria with eyes that had seen it all. "You know, last week, a little girl from the neighborhood came in, crying her eyes out. The chain had fallen off her bicycle, and she thought it was broken forever." He took a slow sip of his coffee. Ethan stopped what he was doing, on a brand new Mercedes no less, and spent half an hour with that little girl. He not only fixed her chain, but he also showed her how it worked, how to fix it herself next time. He didn't charge her a dime. Ben looked directly at Aria, his gaze kind but penetrating. "He doesn't fix things for money, ma'am. He fixes them because they're broken. It's in his nature." The simple story, the simple truth, landed on Aria with the force of a physical blow. It was the key, the missing piece of the puzzle. It wasn't that he didn't value money. It was that he valued other things more. Integrity, purpose, helping a little girl with a broken bicycle. Her perspective shifting, Aria began to see the garage not as a place of failure, but as a place of profound purpose. Her eyes wandered from the tools on the wall to a cluttered workbench in the corner. Tacked to a corkboard, half hidden behind greasy rags and spare parts, were sketches. They weren't rough doodles. They were intricate, complex technical drawings, rendered with an expert hand. They depicted engine designs she had never seen before, innovative, elegant, and impossibly advanced. There were schematics for a hybrid turbine, notes on a new type of fuel injector, and a detailed concept for a rotary engine that was more efficient and powerful than anything currently on the market. This was not the work of a simple grease monkey. This was the work of a genius, a ghost from a different life, a life of brilliance and high-level engineering, was pinned to that corkboard. She realized with a jolt that the man she had dismissed as a simple, unambitious mechanic was hiding a secret, a past that was far more complex and extraordinary than she could ever have imagined. A week later, the official report on the helicopter crash landed on Aria's desk with a heavy thud. It was a thick, jargon-filled document, but one phrase leaped out at her. Catastrophic failure of the primary rotor shaft bearing. A footnote indicated the part number and the manufacturer, a subsidiary acquired by Vale Industries 5 years prior. The news sent a chill down her spine. This was no longer just a near-death experience. It was a corporate crisis. Her company, her empire, was directly implicated. The brand she had built on a reputation of quality and reliability was now linked to a catastrophic failure. As she read further, a sense of cold dread crept over her. The report detailed a history of similar, non-fatal incidents with the same part. Incidents that had been dismissed as minor and logged away in a sea of paperwork. It was a pattern of negligence, a trail of red flags that had been ignored. And now, that negligence had nearly cost her her life. The world she had built was threatening to crumble around her, built on a foundation that was, she was beginning to fear, fundamentally broken. The boardroom was a war room. Lawyers, PR executives, and board members all spoke in urgent, hushed tones, their faces grim. They talked of containment, of narrative control, of legal firewalls. They saw the problem in terms of liability and stock prices, but Aria saw the ghost of a faulty bearing. She saw the face of the pilot who had nearly died with her, and, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she saw Ethan's face, his calm, clear eyes, and his hands that understood how things were supposed to work. The experts in her boardroom had answers that were all about protecting the company, but she needed answers that were about the truth. She needed someone who understood not just the business of machines, but the soul of them. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she had to go back to the garage. She had to ask the one man who had no vested interest in her company's stock price, the one man who had already proven he couldn't be bought. She found him late at night, closing up the garage. The single bare bulb overhead cast long shadows, making the space feel intimate and solemn. She didn't come in her town car, but in a simple taxi. She wasn't wearing a power suit, but simple slacks and a sweater. She was no longer the CEO paying a debt. She was a woman seeking help. She laid the crash report on his workbench, next to a disassembled carburetor. "I need you to look at this," she said, her voice stripped of its usual authority. Not as a CEO, but as someone who was in that helicopter. "They're telling me it was a mechanical failure. I need to know the truth." Ethan looked from the report to her face. He saw the fear and confusion in her eyes, the cracks in her armor. He picked up the document, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the technical data with a speed and comprehension that betrayed his true expertise. He stopped at the annex, his finger tracing the part number of the failed bearing. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His face, usually so calm, hardened into a mask of cold, familiar fury. The part number was burned into his memory. It was the same one, the same substandard component from the same subcontractor that had cost Leo his life all those years ago. The ghost he had tried to outrun had found him. He looked up at Aria, and for the first time, she saw a deep, profound pain in his eyes. "I know this part," he said, his voice low and tight with emotion. "I know why it failed." He saw it all in an instant, the relentless cycle of corporate greed, the same deadly equation of profits over people, playing out again and again. The company that had built this part, responsible for his friend's death, had been swallowed by a bigger fish, Vale Industries. And the woman it had nearly killed was now standing in his garage, asking him for help. The irony was as bitter as ash in his mouth. Aria saw the shift in him, the sudden, raw pain that radiated from him like heat. She didn't understand its source, but she recognized its authenticity. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan was silent for a long moment, the ghosts of the past swirling around him. Part of him wanted to refuse, to tell her to leave, to let her and her corrupt world burn. It was her company, her problem. But he looked at her, and he didn't see a corporate titan. He saw the woman he had pulled from a burning wreck, a woman who was just as much a victim of this system as he and Leo had been. And he saw a chance, not for revenge, but for a justice that had been denied for 15 years. "I'll help you," he said finally, "but on my terms. No money, no lawyers. I just want access to the wreckage. I want to see it with my own eyes." He needed to confront the ghost, to touch the twisted metal and confirm the truth he already knew in his bones. The next day, they stood in a vast, sterile hangar, the kind of place Ethan had sworn he would never set foot in again. In the center of the floor, laid out like a dissected corpse, was the wreckage of the helicopter. The air was cold, clinical, a stark contrast to the warmth of his garage. As they walked towards the mangled aircraft, Ethan began to talk. He told her about his life before the garage, about the Air Force, the blueprints, the dream of flight. He told her about Leo. He didn't tell her everything, not yet, but he gave her enough to understand that for him, this was more than just a mechanical failure. It was personal. Aria listened, silent and enthralled. The image of the humble mechanic was dissolving before her eyes, replaced by a man of immense talent and tragic history. She was beginning to understand the depth of the man she had so easily dismissed, and a profound sense of shame washed over her. He told her about the final meeting before Leo's fatal flight. He described the corporate liaison in vivid detail: the expensive suit, the condescending smile, the polished arguments that prioritized schedules and budgets over the stark warnings of an engineer. He told me the risk was statistically acceptable, Ethan recounted, his voice laced with a quiet 15-year-old bitterness. He made it sound like Leo's life was just a number on a spreadsheet. He described how his superiors had sided with the company, eager to avoid delays and cost overruns. He had been a lone voice of caution, overruled by a system that was designed to protect itself. As he spoke, Aria felt a growing sense of dread. The culture he was describing, one of calculated risks and moral compromises, was uncomfortably familiar. It was the water she swam in every day. She had always thought of it as smart business, but now, hearing it from his perspective, it sounded like a sickness. At the wreckage, Ethan became a different person. The quiet mechanic vanished, and the master engineer took his place. He moved with an authority and precision that left the official investigators, who were also present, in stunned silence. He ignored the official report, starting his examination from scratch. His hands, which Aria had only seen covered in grease, moved over the twisted metal with an almost forensic sensitivity. He pointed out stress fractures invisible to the untrained eye, explained the metallurgical science behind the component's failure, and traced the chain of causation with irrefutable logic. He wasn't just telling her what had happened. He was making her see it, understand it in its raw physical reality. He showed her the flawed bearing, its surface scarred by heat and friction it was never designed to withstand. "This," he said, holding the piece of metal that had almost killed her. "This is what happens when a decimal point on a budget sheet becomes more important than a human life." As Aria looked from the broken part to Ethan's face, a terrible realization began to dawn. The story he had told her about the corporate liaison who had dismissed his warnings 15 years ago was no longer just a tragic backstory. It was an active threat. She pictured the man from Ethan's memory, the practiced smile, the cold eyes, the casual dismissal of human risk. And with a sickening lurch in her stomach, she gave him a name: Arthur Sterling. The subcontractor company that had built the faulty parts all those years ago had been one of her first major acquisitions. Most of its leadership had been replaced, but a few key executives had been kept on for their industry connections. Arthur Sterling was one of them. He now sat on her board of directors. The man who had sent Ethan's friend to his death was one of her most trusted advisors. The sickness wasn't just in her company. It was in the room with her, every Tuesday morning. In that cold, sterile hangar, standing amidst the ruins of her helicopter, the line between their two worlds, his past and her present, evaporated. They were no longer a CEO and a mechanic. They were two survivors of the same crime, separated only by time. She looked at him, truly seeing the immense weight he carried, the quiet integrity that had led him to trade a brilliant career for a life of humble purpose. And he looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the powerful CEO to the woman trapped inside the machine, a woman who was just beginning to realize the machine itself was broken. A fragile, unspoken connection formed between them, forged in shared trauma and a dawning mutual respect. The air was charged with a new kind of tension, no longer about their differences, but about the terrible shared truth they were beginning to uncover. Ethan wasn't finished. His instincts told him there was more to the story than a single batch of bad parts. He spent the next 2 days poring over the helicopter's maintenance logs and the manufacturer's quality control reports, which Aria had provided. Buried deep in the data, he found it, a pattern. A series of falsified inspection reports, signed off by the same plant manager. A deliberate, systematic cover-up, designed to hide the use of the substandard alloy, not just once, but for years. It wasn't just negligence, it was fraud. It was a conscious, calculated decision to endanger lives for the sake of profit margins. He compiled his findings into a single damning file, a clear, irrefutable chain of evidence that led from the broken bearing in his hand, through years of deceit, and directly to the doorstep of Arthur Sterling, the man who had orchestrated the cover-up from the beginning. The ghost of his past now had a face, a name, and a paper trail. Aria sat in her office, the file Ethan had given her lying on the vast expanse of her mahogany desk. It felt heavier than its physical weight, a bomb that could shatter her entire world. She was at a crossroads, facing a choice that would define not only the future of her company, but also the kind of person she was. The old Aria, the ruthless builder of empires, would know exactly what to do. Bury it, settle quietly, fire Sterling with a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, protect the stock price, contain the damage. It was the smart play, the move any other CEO would make. It was the move she had made 100 times before in 100 other situations. But the old Aria hadn't been pulled from a burning wreck by a man who had already lost everything to the very same lie. She hadn't looked into his eyes and seen the cost of acceptable losses. She thought of Ben's words, spoken so simply in the warm light of the garage. He fixes them because they're broken. She looked out her window at the city she had conquered, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in its foundation. Her company was broken. Her moral code was broken, corroded by years of compromise and calculated ambition. She had become one of them, one of the people in suits who had patronized her father and valued a balance sheet more than a human being. The realization hit her with the force of a physical illness. All her success, all her power, had been built on a lie she had told herself, that the rules of integrity didn't apply at the top. She thought of the little girl with the broken bicycle and the simple, profound decency of the man who had stopped to help her. That was a world she wanted to believe in. That was a world worth building. Ethan had given her the file with no instructions, no demands. As he handed it to her, their hands had brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her. He had simply looked at her, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "The truth is in there," he had said. "Now you have to choose what you can live with." He hadn't judged her or pressured her. He had paid her the ultimate respect. He had trusted her to make the right choice. He had placed the full weight of his past, of his friend's memory, and of her future in her hands, and walked away. The choice was hers and hers alone. It was a test, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it was the most important test of her life. The question was no longer what was best for Vale Industries, but what was right. The boardroom was silent, the air thick with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. The faces of her board members, all men of power and influence, were turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and impatience. Arthur Sterling sat to her right, exuding an aura of smug confidence. Aria stood at the head of the table, the file in her hands. Her heart was hammering, but her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear. She didn't start with financials or projections. She started with the story of a flawed rotor bearing. She laid out Ethan's findings, piece by piece, the evidence building into an irrefutable case. She presented the falsified inspection reports, the pattern of negligence, and the undeniable link to the subcontractor Sterling had once managed. The room grew colder with every word. Sterling scoffed, his practiced smile firmly in place. "Aria, this is absurd," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're basing a corporate witch hunt on the word of some back-alley mechanic. This is business. There are always risks, unfortunate events. It's the cost of progress." He looked around the table, seeking allies, appealing to their shared ethos of pragmatism and profit. "Are we going to jeopardize this company's reputation, our shareholder value, over a single, tragic, but statistically insignificant incident?" He was using their language, the cold calculus she knew so well, but the words sounded hollow now, obscene. He was the ghost of every bad decision she had ever made, every moral corner she had ever cut. He was the man from Ethan's past, and he was the man she was about to become if she backed down now. In that moment, Aria made her choice. She looked directly at Arthur Sterling, her gaze as hard as a diamond. "It wasn't a statistically insignificant incident to the man who died 15 years ago, Arthur," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "And it wasn't insignificant to me when I was falling out of the sky." She let the words hang in the air for a beat. Then she picked up her phone from the table. "This isn't a witch hunt. It's a reckoning." She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. With a quiet, deliberate calm, she dialed a number. "Hello," she said, her voice steady. "I need to report a case of criminal fraud and negligence." She gave them Sterling's name and a summary of the evidence. The color drained from Sterling's face. The smug confidence was replaced by a dawning, panicked horror. The rest of the board sat in stunned, absolute silence. Aria had just set fire to her empire to save his soul. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The media descended like vultures. The company's stock plummeted in a sickening, vertical drop. The name Vale, once a symbol of success, became synonymous with scandal. Her board was in chaos, her investors in revolt. By every conventional measure, she had committed corporate suicide. Her carefully constructed world was shattering around her, the high walls of her fortress crumbling to dust. But amidst the wreckage, Aria felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child, a profound, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of freedom. The weight of the compromises, the lies, the relentless pressure to win at all costs was gone. She had lost her kingdom, but she had reclaimed herself. For the first time, she wasn't just a CEO. She was Aria Vale, a woman who had finally chosen what she could live with. That night, she didn't go home to her sterile, empty penthouse. She went to the garage. It was late, and the street was quiet. A single light burned inside. She pushed open the door and found Ethan sitting on a stool, waiting. He wasn't working. He was just sitting there, as if he knew she would come. He looked at her, and his eyes held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. "It's done," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and unshed tears. "I told them everything." She described the boardroom scene, the phone call, the look on Sterling's face, and then the dam of her control, maintained for over a decade, finally broke. She began to cry, not with the quiet, dignified tears of a CEO, but with the racking, soul-deep sobs of a woman who had been through a war. She wasn't crying for her lost fortune or her shattered company. She was crying for the years she had lost, for the person she had become, and for the overwhelming relief of finally doing the right thing. Ethan didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stood up, walked over to her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was firm, steady, a grounding force in the storm of her emotions. It was a gesture of solidarity, of shared history, of profound unspoken understanding. He let her cry until the sobs subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. When she finally looked up at him, her face tear-streaked and raw. He gave her a small, gentle smile. "You fixed it, Aria," he said, his voice soft. And in those 3 simple words, she heard everything she needed to hear. He wasn't talking about the company. He was talking about her. He saw her, the real her, the one buried beneath the armor. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of oil and the ghosts of broken things made whole again, she knew, with an absolute certainty that rocked her to her core, that she was in love with him. In the months that followed, Aria embraced the storm. Instead of fighting the media, she held a press conference and told the unvarnished truth. She accepted full responsibility, not just for the crash, but for the corporate culture that had allowed it to happen. She didn't make excuses, she made promises. She started the long, arduous process of rebuilding Vale Industries from the ground up, not on a foundation of profit, but on a foundation of integrity. She fired the old guard, promoted young idealists, and instituted radical transparency policies. She was a different kind of leader now, one who listened more than she commanded, one who valued her employees' well-being as much as her company's bottom line. She was often seen on the factory floors, talking to workers, learning their names, understanding their challenges. She was no longer building an empire. She was building a community. One evening, she found herself back at the garage, not as a client or a woman in crisis, but as a visitor. She walked over to the corkboard in the corner and looked again at Ethan's designs. They were more than just brilliant engineering. They were expressions of his core philosophy. They were designs for a better world, a world where things were built to last, where safety wasn't a feature but a prerequisite, where efficiency didn't come at the cost of the environment. They were the dreams of a man who believed in fixing what was broken. She saw a path forward, not just for her company, but for both of them. A future where his genius and her vision could come together to create something truly extraordinary. She saw his dream, and she realized, with a sudden clarity, that it had also become hers. She found him working late, as always. She didn't beat around the bush. She didn't frame it as a business proposition. She framed it as a partnership. "I want to build this," she said, pointing to a sketch of the hybrid turbine. "All of this, I'm creating a new R&D division at Vale, an innovation lab with an unlimited budget and complete autonomy. I want it to be the soul of the new company." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "I don't want to hire you, Ethan. I want to partner with you. I want you to run it. I want you to build your dream with me." It was an offer of stunning trust and magnitude, a testament to how much she had changed. She wasn't offering him a job. She was offering him a blank canvas and the resources of her entire world to paint his masterpiece. Ethan looked at her, then at his designs, then back at her. A part of him, the part that had been wounded so badly by the corporate world, was terrified. He had built a safe, simple life here in his garage. A life where he was in control, where his integrity could never be compromised. To go back into that world, even with her, was a risk. But then he looked into her eyes, and he didn't see the ruthless CEO he had first met. He saw the woman who had cried in his garage, the woman who had torched her kingdom for the sake of doing what was right. He saw a partner he could trust, a person whose values now mirrored his own. He saw a chance not just to build his dream, but to share it. He took a deep breath, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Okay, Aria, he said. Let's build it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of creation. The cold, sterile floors of a forgotten Vale Industries warehouse were transformed into a vibrant, state-of-the-art workshop, a place that hummed with the energy of innovation. It was a perfect fusion of their two worlds, the cutting-edge technology of her resources and the hands-on, tangible spirit of his garage. They worked side by side, a seamless team. His visionary genius would spark an idea, and her strategic mind would instantly see the path to making it a reality. They challenged each other, pushed each other, and brought out the absolute best in each other. Their dynamic was electric, a partnership of equals that inspired everyone around them. The line between their professional and personal lives began to blur, a distinction that no longer seemed to matter. The long nights spent poring over schematics bled into shared meals, first from takeout containers in the workshop, then at quiet restaurants where they would talk for hours. The conversations shifted from torque ratios and material sciences to their pasts, their families, their deepest fears, and most secret hopes. He learned about the dusty attic and the shame of her father's failure. She learned about the fierce loyalty he had felt for his friend Leo and the guilt he still carried. They were two broken people who, in fixing a broken company, were slowly, carefully fixing each other. They were building more than just new engines. They were building a new life, a life founded on a trust and understanding so profound it felt like it had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. One night, they were alone in the workshop, standing in front of the first completed prototype of his hybrid turbine, a gleaming marvel of engineering and a testament to their shared dream. The moment felt sacred, quiet, perfect. It was Aria who broke the silence. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the low light of the workshop. "You know," she began, her voice soft but sure, "when you pulled me from that helicopter, you saved my life. But that's not the most important thing you did." She took his greasy, calloused hands in her own. "You gave me a life worth living. You taught me what it means to be strong, what it means to be good. You fixed me, Ethan." She took a shaky breath, her heart full. "I don't want to be your partner just in business." She looked him directly in the eye, her soul bared. "Ethan, will you marry me?" A year later, Vale Innovations, the division Ethan had built, was the most celebrated and successful part of the company. His designs were not just profitable, they were revolutionary, setting new standards for safety and sustainability across the entire industry. Vale Industries, once on the brink of collapse and disgrace, was more respected and successful than ever, a beacon of what a modern, ethical corporation could be. The story of the CEO and the mechanic had become a legend, a source of inspiration that was taught in business schools. But for Aria and Ethan, the true success wasn't in the stock price or the headlines. It was in the quiet life they had built together, a life of shared purpose and profound love. Their wedding was not a grand affair for the society pages. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in a beautifully restored historic building, its exposed brick and warm wood a perfect reflection of their joined worlds. Ben, his eyes twinkling, served as Ethan's best man. Marcus, no longer anxious but filled with a quiet joy for his boss, looked on with a genuine smile. It was a celebration not of a merger of fortunes, but of a meeting of souls. It was a testament to the fact that the strongest foundations are not built of steel and glass, but of trust, integrity, and the courage to fix what is broken. It was a quiet, perfect, and beautiful new beginning. The final scene is not in a boardroom or a workshop. It is on the balcony of their new home, a place filled with warmth, light, and laughter. It overlooks the city, but the view is different now. It is no longer a kingdom to be conquered, but a community to be a part of. Aria stands with her head on Ethan's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. They watch the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. There are no words, only a comfortable, peaceful silence. They had fallen from the sky, met in the wreckage, and together they had learned how to fly again. Their story was a simple one, a reminder that the greatest value is not what you own, but what you stand for, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the one who simply reminds you how to save yourself.